Hello students, this second out of our 3 planned videos for this tutorial, we are starting with creating the enemy. So we ended up at this point, we've created the player, we've been able to get that player to move around properly and animate, and the last thing we basically did was to hide that hide that player I should say, so that we're ready to move on. So we're now in this section, which is creating the enemy, and we're going to do this one and probably the second section, the next section in this video, maybe a little bit shorter than the first one. One of the things, of course, we're going to start seeing is that the instructions become a little bit more generic as we go. So we can already see here that in creating the enemy, we're going to create a new scene called mob. And it also then talks about down here, the different nodes that we're going to have to add, and if need be, how we might rename them. It's not going through it step by step anymore. It's expecting us to have some understanding from the previous sections. So we're going to start off by creating this new mob. So we're going to start by creating a new scene. So we can come up to the scene area and say new scene. We can see that the scene is going to be this new type called a rigid body 2D. Now, as we read further down, we're going to learn what a rigid body 2D does. But for now, we need to say other node, and we need to look for that rigid body. Make sure that you are choosing the rigid body 2D and not the 3D. So there we go. And we can already tell that we need to name it as mob, remembering to use capitals that match. With this mob, this rigid body 2D, we need to add an animated sprite 2D, a collision shape 2D, and a visible on-screen notify 2D. This again is a new one that we'll learn more about as we go. So with the mob selected, we press plus, and some of these I've already used recently, so already can see my animated sprite is here, so I'm just going to throw it in quickly. I can also add in my collision shape 2D because that's something we've used recently, and the last one that I need is this new one, visible, so I'm going to search for that. So there's my visible on-screen notify, not enable, sorry, visible on-screen notify 2D, so make sure you choose the right one and put that in as well. So there you go, you can see these are being added in. Okay, we're going to select the mob node and set its gravity scale property in the rigid body 2D section of the inspector. So choosing our mob, making sure we've got our inspector selected over here, and in the rigid body 2D section. So if we look through, here is the rigid body 2D. We need to change the gravity scale, and we're setting that to 0. Now, the reason we're doing that is explained a little bit further, but in essence, a rigid body 2D uses gravity or physics to help do things, and we're basically setting this gravity to 0 because we're not actually going to use the gravity value. So as it says here, this will prevent the mob from falling downwards. So in addition to this, in the collision object 2D, so make sure we're choosing that. All right, we need to also set some values. So we're going to set the collision mask. So in here, we're going to come down in the rigid body 2D section. We're going to change the rigid body to collision. Sorry, I'm in the wrong spot. Sorry, I've got to choose my mob first, of course. Rigid body 2D. Underneath here is the collision, and we need to change some things. So we're going to change the collision group and uncheck the one inside mask property. So here's the one inside mask. We're turning this off. This will make sure that the mobs don't collide with each other. Now, these collision layers are again something that will be explained in more detail as we go through, but if we make sure we read and follow the steps, then we're okay. We're now going to set up our animated sprite. So like before, we come into animated sprite. We're going to tell it that we need a new sprite frames, and we're going to click on that to bring up our animation area, and we're going to add these 3 in: fly, swim, and walk. So here's the default one. We'll use this for fly. Again, they're in lowercase at the moment. If yours closes like mine did, just open it up again. We'll add in a new animation, and I'm sorry, I don't know why it's closing on me. We'll just keep trying. Fly, swim, and one more for walk. Okay, and these are all in this case in lowercase, just like they are here. And we can go into each of those and we can add the right graphic in. So from our art, we can see that there is a flying made up of 2. So let's take both of those and bring them into the flying. And it does indicate that we want to also change the animation speed to be 3. So up here, the frames per second, it's defaulting to 5. We'll turn it down to 3. For the swim, we want to do the same thing. There's 2 that make up the swimming enemy. Okay, and we're going to set that to be 3 frames per second as well. And finally, the walking, let's bring those 2 in and also set that to be 3 frames per second. So that's what it's talking about here. And as it mentioned, we can also use the play animation button to see what each of those look like. So for example, the walk, if I press the play animation here, I can see what they'll look like if I jump back to my 2D for a second. That's what it's looking like there. Okay, so if I change each of those, you can see the different animations that they would be doing. Okay, and of course you can stop or pause that animation at any time. Rightio. We're also going to scale them again. So the animated sprite, so make sure we've got animated sprite, move across here to the inspector, we're going to transform it, and in our scale we're making these 0.75, so 3/4 of their original size. So we'll put that in and you can see that changing up the top. All right. And the final thing we want to do is we're also adding a capsule shape 2D for the collision. So we come to our collision shape. We're going to add in a new collision shape being a capsule. And in this case, we're going to make it longer and wide and thinner, sorry. So that way and this way. Now what we might need to do, as it says here, is to rotate because the capsule is trying to go up and down. So if we rotate that, so we look at our shape, we look at our transform, and we look at our rotation, we can type 90 degrees in, and you can now see that the capsule is in this direction. So I'm going to make it about as wide as the enemy and about as long as the enemy, something maybe like that. Okay, so let's be clear what we've done so far. We have set up the structure, we have gone into our mob, we have fixed up the gravity, we have fixed up the masking so that they don't collide with each other, we have done our animations, we have also changed the speed of the animations to 3, we have made sure that our collision shape is correct, and that is essentially it. So we now have an enemy scene. So let's make sure that scene is saved. So save scenes. And again, like before, I'm saving it in a scene folder and I'm pressing save. I'm just going to keep it called mob. That is fine. We're now ready to add a script to this enemy. So just like before, we're going to click the mob. We're going to add a script and we can leave it like that, except for I do want to change its location because I am keeping mine organized. So all my scripts are going in a folder. So I'm going to save those to my scripts folder and still going to call it mob. That is fine. Right, so it is extending the rigid body 2D. We've already got that here because I chose to keep the default options. We're now going to use a ready function. So I have a ready, so I can remove this pass from my ready and I can copy in this content. In fact, what I'll do is copy the whole content and I'm going to paste it over the top of the existing one. Okay, so if I scroll back so you can see it, there's our ready function. This is setting up a variable called mob types and it is getting the different animation names. Now this is going to be important because this is how we're going to determine a randomized enemy basically. So we're getting the names of the 3 different types of animations, walk, fly and swim I think it was, and we're going to see those being used later on. It's then picking one of those randomly to play. So it's saying, hey, randomly pick one of those 3 and use that to play the right image, or the right animation. Sorry, that's how we're going to get different ones. And that's all explained in here. Okay, so that's what all this section is talking about, how that randomization works. Now we're going to use this on visibility notifier. So this is that last section we had, that last node, I should say, that we haven't used yet. We're going to be using that in just a second. All right. So when they go off the screen, we want to be told and then we want to do something. So we're going to use the signal for this visibility on screen. So if we have that chosen, we come across to node, you see there is a signal for screen exited. So when this particular node goes off the screen, this will happen. So we're going to choose that signal and say, yep, connect it to the current script. So this is going to happen whenever we go off the screen. And we're using a simple command called Q free, We may or may not have seen that yet, but basically Q3 just means get rid of this whole scene. So in this case, it's going to delete essentially this particular enemy or this particular mob from our game, and that's how we make sure we don't have them going infinitely off the screen. So that's going to essentially finish off the main script for our enemy. So let's make sure that's saved again. So save everything and we are good. Let's move on. Now we're setting up the main game loop. Okay, so again, we need to set up a new scene, and it's going to be a simple node, and we're going to call it main. So over here again, scene, new scene. It's a simple node, so we'll just call this node. It's the most basic node you can get. It is the node. So let's choose that. And of course, we are told to make this called main with a capital M. Okay, and it talks a little bit why we're using a node and not a node 2D, but you can read that for yourself. Now, new thing, we're going to create a copy, a version of a scene we already have, and that scene is going to be our player scene. So we're going to come over here, and just like we did before when we would normally click the plus to get one of the built-in nodes, we're going to do something similar. We're going to click the little chain icon here, which is the instance, and we can now choose one of the scenes that we have made. So this is the player scene. Now I've saved my player scene with a capital P. That's the only difference between these two, so I'm still going to choose it. So I've brought in now a player, which is all the things that we've built about our player into our game. Okay, we're also going to add some additional scenes, nodes. So we're going to add 3 things called timers and also a marker 2D, and each of these are going to have different names. So let's add those in. So with main as our root, not the player that we just brought in, but main, we're going to add in, let's search for a timer. Let's add 1 in. Now, because we've just chosen it, it should come up in our recent. So let's add a second one, and let's add a third timer, and then another node called a marker 2D. Whoops, now you might have noticed what I did accidentally. Because I had timer 2 chosen, this became a child. So I can delete or rename it, or remove it, sorry, but I want to make sure that it is a child of main and not of another timer. And finally, here we go. Let's get this marker 2D also as a child. Let's go through and rename things. So the first timer is going to be called mob timer. The second timer is going to be score timer. And the third, didn't type that very well, sorry, score timer. And the third one is going to be start timer. And again, pay attention to the capitalizations. And the marker 2D is going to be renamed to be start position. Okay, check all your capitals. I made a mistake there, and spelling is correct. We now want to set some values. So the wait timer of each of these timers needs to be set as follows. So for the mob timer, if I come across into the inspector, there is my wait timer. I want that to be set at the 0.5. For the score timer, it says to set that at 1. It already is. And for the start timer, I want to set that at 2. That's basically how long these timers will go for before they time out. In addition, we've also got something called a one-shot property that we need to set for those. So in addition, set the one-shot property of the start timer. So let's go back to start timer. One shot needs to be on. And also we want to change the position of the start position. We want to give it a position of 240 and 450. So if we have a look here, start position, if we look at transform, here is our position. We want that to have a position of 240 and 450. So that's a lot of changes to make and very little instruction, because by now we definitely expect that we can look at this and go, yep, I understand what to do. Right now, we're now going to look at how we spawn or create mobs in our game. Okay, so this main node, the one that we're just creating, will be responsible for bringing in new enemies, and it's going to do that using something called a path 2D. So I'm going to jump to the 2D screen. This is what we're currently seeing. So here is my game window, this blue line going around. Here is my player at the moment that is not really going to be used yet, but we just got it ready. We don't see timers. They don't show up in the game itself. And here is that start position that we created. So that's that little crosshair. It's put it here because we set that value just before. So this is looking good so far. Now we're going to add in, with main being its parent, of course, we're going to add in this new idea of a path 2D. So let's add in a node, path 2D. Okay, so we added that in. When we have that path 2D chosen, you'll see some new values up the top, and that's what's showing here. We're going to use this to create a path around the outside. So going to click in the first spot, okay, which is going to be up here. Now the problem is our player is in the way, so I might just move our player out of the way for a second. We'll take our path 2D again, make sure we've chosen to add in new points. That's here, sorry, I forgot to click that before. And I'm going to click a point out here. And I just realized I clicked the zoom by accident. Let's try that again. A point here, good. Then I'm going to put a new point here. And I'm just going to go around the outside. Each time you create a new point, you can see it is creating this box around. I'm going to come to here. And then because I want to join it back together. Now don't be confused. This red or this orange box is not joined. You can see the sort of arrowy line. That's my path. I want to join it back up. And I can do that by choosing the close option. I think it's this one, yep, close curve. So that's going to take it from the last point back to the first in a straight line. So if I do that, you can see it's closed it off. At any time, I can also come along and adjust these points. So let's say I want this a little bit further out that way. Oops, sorry, I just realized I was adding new points in, so let's undo that. I want to be moving the point, sorry. I can move that point out, and I can adjust until I am happy with those points. It wasn't moving. Oh, that's not what I want either. Why did it not move? Let's zoom in a bit and that might help. Oh, yeah, that's better. That's what I wanted. All right, so we've made this path that goes around. If we go down a bit further, and there's a little animation of what you actually needed to do, we're now going to add in this path follow 2D node. Okay, it's now a child of the mob path. And I realized that back here I forgot to rename this path 2D. So this should have been renamed mob path, because as a child of this down here, we want to add the path follow 2D and rename it as well. So this is going to have its own child. It's going to be a path 2D following, and we're going to rename this to be mob spawn location. Okay. Now, because this is a child of the path we just drew, it's going to automatically follow this path. So essentially, you've got this invisible thing, because it doesn't have a shape, constantly moving around this path. All right. And that's going to be used by our main scene to, at random times, say, hey, wherever this thing going around is, create a new enemy from there to come into the screen. So it's going to give us the appearance of randomness. So this thing's constantly going around and around and around, and we just every so often say, hey, wherever you are, create a new enemy, and that's going to be the point it starts from, and they come into the screen. Oh, it's over here now, create a new one, and so on and so forth. So that gives us the illusion, at least, of a random enemy. Okay, let's keep going. This is a fairly long part. We're going to add our script now to our main, so come up to the top and add a script as we've done before. Make sure you save it if you're following my instructions in the scripts folder, which I'm happy with. There we go. Now, again, it extends node. We're happy with that, but we are bringing in some variables. So let's copy these in and put them just below. So as we learned before, the export keyword means that we can change that value here in the inspect. You can see it already. And we've also set up a score variable ready to use later on. And again, these are explained here. We're now going to drag the mob scene from our file system into this scene here. That's the one we just made. So let's go to our scenes. Let's find our mob scene and drag that into here. So this is basically a way of saying, hey, we're going to use the mob scene that we've already created that knows how to animate and move and all that sort of stuff. And we're going to be using that. We're now going to select our instance of player. Okay, under the scene, here it is over here. And we're going to make sure it has a signals tab selected. So, yep, node, here we go. So we're looking for the list of signals for the player, and we're going to double click on the one called hit. Now that was the one that we made earlier. It's our own custom signal. So we're going to use that signal now. All right, let's bring it in. Okay, and it's going to run a new function called game over. Sorry, I'm just double reading this to make sure. Okay, so we're going to do this a little bit differently. Sorry, so I'm going to actually undo that. So let's right click and disconnect. My apologies. When I do this hit, I don't want on play hit to be what happens. I want something else. So we're going to make a new function called game over. Yep, so we want to run the game over scene. Oh, sorry, script. So let's go game over in here, underscore over, just like it's showing. And it's made that for us. And you can see that's the one it's linked to. We can get rid of this function that we made accidentally before. Now in there, we're going to copy this bit of code. So the game over is actually just a point of, first of all, saying stop the score timer and stop the mob timer. Okay. We also want this new function called new game. So let's put that below as well. Okay. We're now going to connect the timeout signal of each of the timer nodes to some functions. Okay. So we'll start with the first timer. So the mob timer. In fact, we're going to apparently start with the start timer. So let's go start timer. Its signal of timeout is going to connect to this start timeout. And then the second one we're going to do is the on score. So let's do the score timer, timeout. Now they've put in the stubs for us, and we can add a little bit of code. So for the time or the score one, sorry, we're simply adding to our score. So we can replace that bit there with the score +1, and for the time out on start we are putting these two lines in, which we will learn are about starting the mobs and starting the scoring. Okay, so let's have those two functions in there. Now this is where it looks like it gets really busy, but we're going to go through this fairly easily, and you'll see it's actually well commented. So we've got a new function on mob timer timeout. So that is going to be this timer here. Let's set the timeout. So here is the function, but we need to copy all of this. So I'm going to simply copy everything here and replace this with it. So there it is. Now, again, I'm going to quickly run through it, but you should read through this in detail. But essentially this mob timer, when it times out, that's one that's going to say, hey, create a new enemy, a new mob. It's going to create a new one. It's going to set its location based on the location of that path thing going round and round. It's going to set a direction, again, using that information. There's an important box here that talks about how we're using pi, and that you definitely should have a read of that. Set its position, set its direction, all that stuff is done based on the position of that mob path location thing that's going round and round. Finally, we set its speed, and then the last part is we add that to our game. Okay, so hopefully we're almost ready to test, and we can do that by simply adding the new game option into the ready. So earlier on we had a ready, it's currently doing nothing, but if we replace that with new game, then that is going to start this, which is going to start the rest of the game. Okay, we're also at this point finally going to set our main scene as the scene that runs. So you'll remember so far we've been clicking on one of these to play just the individual scene. If we click on here, the normal play, it would have given us an error saying, hey, we don't have one set. So let's first of all save this scene. And again, let's make sure we're saving it correctly. And if we click on this play, and oops, I just realized I've got a recording thing in the way, so let's get that out of the way and press play. This is the error I'm talking about. Hey, we don't have a scene as our main scene. So we can say select current, or we can say select and choose one of the scenes that we're going to run, which in this case is the main scene. So now our game should start. There is our play, and you saw he's moved to the position that we had from that start position over here. So the start position. You can see the enemies are coming on. They look random. They run directions. Obviously, nothing is dying. We can move our player, but we're not dying. There's no sounds or anything. But we are definitely getting randomized enemies on our screen. So as it says here, when we're ready or sure that everything is working like it's shown here, we can replace that new game with a pass again because we're not actually ready for that. So we come back into our game. I'm just going to comment it out actually by putting, or else forget which program language I'm using, a hash in front that's going to pass it out. And I'm going to put a pass back in because I can't just have an empty function. That fixes that error up. So now if I try to run it, again, the game will run, but nothing will seem to happen because technically I haven't told the game to start. But that is correct for this point. And this is where I'm going to leave this video. You can obviously continue on from here. We're going to be adding in collisions. We're going to be adding in the music, the sound, all that sort of stuff in the next section. Hey, I'm back really quickly because I already realized there is a mistake in my game, which some of you may have picked up. Now, to help explain it, I'm going to show you a couple of quick things. So what I've done at the moment is when I played the game, I realized that the enemy wasn't stopping and disappearing like it should. So the game was continuing, and that made me think something is incorrect, which it was. So to test this out, I've done a couple of things. Firstly, I went to the debug menu at the top and I turned on this option of visible collision shapes. Now, if that's not turned on, the game looks like this, normal. So there is my player. In a second, I get enemies coming out. That's all good. By turning on that option, I can now see those collision capsules. So if I play my game now, you can see there is the collision capsule for my player, and as enemies come out, you can see theirs as well. And this is what I'm talking about. The enemies and player are obviously colliding, but nothing was happening. To try and prove that to myself as well, I went into the hit where that was happening. So in my main, in the script, I came out to this game over. So this should be happening when the hit signal is sent from the player. And I added in a print statement. Now this print statement simply prints this information inside the quotation marks down here in my debug area. So what I was expecting to see is this function gets called when a player hits an enemy, and I'll see one lot of player hit down here, and then these would happen, which would eventually stop all the enemies from coming through. I also would expect my player to disappear because if I go back to my player script, this here should be happening, which starts by hiding the player. So I can see if I run this game again that that wasn't happening. So here is my player going to get hit by someone eventually. That would have just been a hit. That definitely is a hit, but we're not seeing that come up down the bottom. We're not seeing the enemies stop, all that sort of thing. So I know something's wrong. And the astute ones of you may have already noticed that this is not running. And we know it's not running because we're not getting that signal. So the on body entered is a signal of my player, and that therefore should have one of those little icons on the side saying it's linked in. And if I go back to my player, the collision shape, and I go to its nodes, I can see that, sorry, not the collision shape, sorry, the player, I can see that this on body entered wasn't linked. Now I may have done that at one point and delete it without realizing it, but this signal needs to happen for this to be triggered. So let's link that signal to the player, yes, and you can now see there is that little icon. Tell me, hey, when that signal goes off, so when something, another body, in this case the enemy, comes into contact with my player, this signal will happen, which means this gets run. So let's now see what that does to our game. So here is our player. Let's collide with something. Bang. There is that player hit text that I've got temporarily. And we saw, and unfortunately I've just made it disappear, but we saw that the player disappeared. So let's do that again. We see the player disappears, and The enemies will go off the screen, but no more are being created because technically we've now also stopped the timer that makes new enemies. So there was a little mistake I had made in my game video, probably back in video 1 actually, where I didn't have this linked properly. And I could pretend that was a deliberate mistake to show you how to debug your game. It wasn't. It was a genuine mistake, but it does still prove that point, that when you have something that doesn't quite work properly, there was no error coming up. This wasn't actually a game error. It was a logic error, or what we commonly refer to as a bug. Basically, it was my fault, my mistake, and I had to go back through the logic of my game, the way it should work, to find out where I've made the mistake. And it turns out, as I said, it was that I didn't have this signal linked. So obviously when I was skimming through trying to do this quickly and not reading it completely like I've asked you to do, I missed a step and didn't link this in. Now that I know that is working, I would go back now to my main scene. I would go to its script and I would probably take out this print because I don't want to see that. And I can also, if I want, turn off the shape collisions. So now I'm back to a game that just runs the way it should. So you can no longer see the collision capsules. That's fine. When I do collide, it's still doing what it should do. So no more enemies are being spawned. And now in the next section, we will look at putting a game over screen and all those sorts of things. But we did need to fix that issue because by the stage we got to, we should have had collisions working. So again, hopefully that has helped fix the mistake in your game if you were following absolutely what I was doing. Or if you've got a similar error, it's given you an example of how you need to track back through your program to work out where the mistake is. That's now the official end of this video. I look forward to working with you in video number 3.